Hey everybody, welcome to the Metal Mill 52 workshop. Thought I'm going to try an experiment today. I'm going to try to splice a few videos together because there are several things that I hope to accomplish today that are all relevant to this project. And so I'm going to start out with a little introduction and plan of attack and tell you what I'm going to do, how I'm going to do it, hopefully. And as we go along through the day, I'm going to try to film little pieces of the project and splice them all together and put them all in one video instead of doing several little ones. As you guys know, I don't normally do a lot of editing. I kind of shoot little summaries of projects in hopes that that's helpful. So let me try a little different approach. We'll see how it works. This is the bevel, the drilling arm. I forget the exact proper name, but the arm that goes on top of here's the drill head, there's the post, and these are the parts that I made last week and I published a little video about. Also, there's still photos on Instagram if you missed any of the action and wanted to know more about it. So the little gimbal head, as you can see, I've made the screws that go in that hold it together, and I've also made the little housings for them, for lack of a better word. And what I did, I took a little departure from the actual plans. I thought there's no reason to not make a shoulder here and then silver solder these in. So I measured the outside dimensions. Get that back. Measured the outside dimensions, and I knew that what the inside space is supposed to be like. So I basically just calculated how far these little tubes needed to stick through, and I left a little shoulder and I drilled and tapped them. So this is really going to be hard to take apart with one hand, but this is a two-piece thing. There's a housing that has a shoulder on it, and yes, my left hand is talented enough to unscrew this thing as we go. So I made two of those, and these are the little screws that go into the gimbal housing on top of the drill spindle. So let me finish unscrewing it. It has a model engineer thread. You don't really have to use this. I mean, I happen to have the taps and dies for this, so I went ahead and used it, but it's a 3/16 40 thread. If you're wondering, that here you can see it pretty clearly. And this is basically a 1/8 by 1/8 little tip that goes into the side of the gimbal housing. Now what I haven't done yet is finish the heads of the screws, and put a screw slot in there. And I have a setup for that I'll show you in just a second. And also, the book calls for case hardening these screws. So my plan of attack, the very next thing I get done, as a matter of fact, as soon as I finish shooting this intro part of the video, is to take both of the screws and place them in the lathe. I'm not going to turn the lathe on at first, but I use a dremel and cut a screw groove in here for a slotted, screwdriver. Then I'll finish, while this is in the lathe, I'll use files and finish the outside of the screw heads so they look decent. And then they'll be ready to take and case harden. So I'll do the same thing on the other side here. Put that out. I did want to show how nice, last time you saw this thing, it was just rough filed. And I spent about literally an hour yesterday with 220 grit, then I think 320 and 400 and some 600 grit sandpaper to get it to a nice satiny finish. And of course, the only bad thing about silver soldering is once I silver solder, that's going to cause a little discoloration, and I'll have to buff it all out again after I soak it in the pickle. But I'm real pleased with how that came out. Little drill arm. Put it up here, you can see what it's going to look like. So it's going to look real nice. I'll buff it again once I pickle the silver soldering and so forth. So let me show you how, while I'm at it, I can show you the drill set up in the lathe. I've got a 3/16 inch 5C collet in there. So I'm going to place the screw in. If I can get it in there. Alright, so the screw's in. I'll tighten that up, and then the setup here, I've got this homemade thing. I made this a long time ago when I was mostly using the Lathe Master lathe. It's literally just a hunk of aluminum, an old chunk that I notched for the tool holder. I've got it clamped down, and I drilled and tapped the aluminum for the screw nose piece of a Dremel. And the Dremel, sorry about my finger in the way there. It's like a 3/4 10 pitch thread, I believe. And you can just screw the Dremel in, it's nice and secure. And I've got a cutting wheel in there. It's 50 thousandths inch cutting wheel. So I will tighten this up, and I'm going to use my DRO. I can place the cutting wheel against the outside of it, move it over to the very center, and then just with this completely stationary, go ahead and just turn the Dremel on, cut the wheel just with the motion of the lathe here. Just introduce it in to cut the slot, and then when I'm done with that, I'll take that away, take the Dremel away, and I'll be able to run the lathe and round the screw head over, and then they'll both the screws will then be ready for case hardening. So if all goes well, I'll have a couple more segments. I'll do this part off camera, and at least you'll know how the screws got their slots in them, and then I will go outside. It's a beautiful day outside there. I'll go out and do some silver soldering and some case hardening and capture that on film at least a little bit, and that will be the bulk of the work for the project today. Thanks for watching, everybody. Stay tuned for the next segment. Over the whine of the Dremel. This is where I'm cutting the screw head slot. I had to move the Dremel down a little bit so the center of the cutter was in line with the center of the screw head. It's going really well. I'll come out and cool it off a little bit. It's been a while since I've done something like this, but I think the plunge technique is probably the best. Lets the cutter cool off a little bit. The cutter itself is 50 thousandths of an inch wide, so it should give a nice screw slot. Plenty big. I'm just going to go a little bit further. Let's see how deep that is. Let's go that's about a 1/16 of an inch. Actually about 65 thousandths. Let's take a look. It's looking pretty good. I don't know if you can see it as well as I can, but pretty happy with that. We'll get ready to go ahead and do the next one, and then we can do some silver soldering and some heat treating. Hey everybody, welcome to segment number 2. If you can see this, I've got the gimbaled arm in place, and after machining, I carefully cleaned all the parts with acetone, both the little stub, shoulders, collars, and the inside of the frame, and I let that dry. And then what I just did a minute ago, I put some paste flux around where I want the silver solder to go, and then I've put it all together, and I've got the little pieces of silver solder. If you can see this, this is the method that Kozo Hiroaka describes for silver soldering. It's extensive, what I've used extensively for all my model engineering type projects. So I've got the silver solder in place. Now all I have to do is heat up, and if you'll notice, I put the silver solder on the inside, and I did that on purpose because what I'm going to do is heat up the outside edges of the stubs and the frame here. That's the part I want to join together, mostly the steel here, the steel ring, and that will draw. If I heat from the outside, the solder, when it melts, it goes in the direction of the heat. So that's the idea there. So one thing I just noticed here, I'm going to try to get this a little bit more level. It's kind of one side uphill, one side downhill. It looks a little bit more level. I'm using some concrete blocks and bricks and so forth as my table. I've been doing it this way for years, so hopefully that will make sense. I'm going to leave the thing playing here, and let me see if I can tilt that down at all. We'll get this segment done, and we'll do the part next with the case hardening. It's a little breezy out today. There we go. All right. Solder's melting, and I can see it on the coming over to this side. That's a very good thing. I'm going to keep the heat on it a little bit more. Hopefully it'll spread out some. You can see the solder wick to the inside there. A little turbo torch there, so I think we're in good shape with that. My next step is to let that cool. As you can see, it got pretty warm pretty quickly, being thin, relatively thin steel. So I'm going to let it cool in the air here, and then after this cools, then I'll place it in the pickle. So the next step for me is to heat up, I don't know if you can see these two little the screws. Show you, this is how the heads came out in the lathe there with the Dremel tool. Very happy with this one. The other one, for some odd reason, I guess the screw itself wasn't perfectly centered in the lathe, and the 5C chuck or the blade of the Dremel took a little bend, so I got the center cut a little bit off center, so it looks a little goofy, but I'm not worried about it. I don't want to spend the time to remake that whole screw. So the process for here, I use this for case hardening. Use this stuff called Cherry Red, and what I'll do, I think I got this from MSC. Basically, I think it's a calcium carbonate type thing, like a bone, and what I'll do is you put some of this in I'll put it in a little container. I've got an Altoid tin I'm planning on using. You heat the parts up cherry red, you dip the parts in the calcium carbonate stuff, the cherry red powder. It's a powder. Cover all the surface, then you reheat it to another cherry red and then quench it in water. So before I start this process, I'm going to go ahead and get some water. I forgot to bring a little water container out with me, but I'll do that. And then, so that can soak in water to clean up while this soaks in pickle and cleans up this afternoon. Then I'll have to take and sand and buff this all out again, and probably run the tap through that one more time just to make sure everything's all set. So that's the end of part 2. Hey everybody, welcome to part 3. Got the torch going. Let's see if I can heat these babies up. Cherry red. There we go, black. There we go, that's kind of red. I'll do one at a time. So you can see it nice and red there at the point where we want it to be hardened. The whole thing is red. Take it. one. Kind of fun, actually. Starting to change color. Now it's getting red. Red through and through. Put it in the cherry red compound. Gotta swish it all around. Alright. That's normal. I've not done this a bunch of times, but it's normal for the cherry red compound to blister up. It even says so on the directions. And after we heat each one up cherry red again, then we'll quench it in the water. Alright. Looks like it's getting pretty hot. It's hard to tell because it's got that coating on it. But you can see it glowing a bit. Yeah. Especially the part that we want really hard. Got a little pickle jar. Take the torch away, you can see the part remains kind of reddish. Make sure it's heated through and through. There we go. Drop it in the water. Now we can cut the torch off. And this cherry red compound, this is what it looks like. I put some in a little Altoid tin just to make it easier to use rather than dipping it in the big bucket there. But the only time I've ever used this stuff before was in case hardening the expansion links on my locomotive. So once we soak this, they'll cool down, then I'll clean them up and we can test them with a file and make sure that we've got them, you know, that the hardening process is complete. So here's the other part, the gimbal bed that's been resting and cooling. It sure looks ugly, but I think I got a very nice soldering job underneath all that. Usually it's not that ugly, but we'll clean that up and buff it up and you'll be amazed at how good that looks. So hopefully I'll be able to weave all these together into one cohesive video for you. Thanks for watching. I'll keep you posted. Hey everybody, today is still Sunday. This will be maybe the 4th episode that I'll splice in. Wanted to show this thing is looking good here. Let me see if I can set this down. And there we go. The camera stand is now on top of the pillar tool table. But this, last time you saw this, I had just finished silver soldering it, and it was all nasty and dirty looking. As you can see, the solder went in really, really nicely. All I've done so far, I pickled this, and then I washed it, rinsed it in water, soapy water, and dried it all off. And then I ran over the whole thing with a wire wheel, and a Dremel wire wheel. I think it was a stainless steel one. And then I used one of the Dremel buffing wheels just to get some of the excess dirt off. And now what you can see I'm doing is, this is the 3/16" 40 Model Engineer tap. I'm just running it through this side, and I was going to do it through the other side, and that gave me the inspiration I ought to do the video. Let me be real careful. I don't want to mess those threads up. There we go. So also I did a little hand countersink on all of these edges here. So those things came out really, really nicely, and I'm really thrilled how that looks and how nicely it cleaned up. I mean, I'm not even done cleaning this thing up yet, because obviously it's going to be one of the most visible pieces of the whole machine. I will, after I get done with this, I'll probably oil them down with some WD-40 and then use some of that wet or dry sandpaper, maybe the 400 and 600 grit again, just to get some of the residue off of it. But just going through with the tap, the 3/16 inch 40 thread per inch tap just to clean off anything that's inside there and that might have gotten in during the silver soldering process. It's clean, it looks good, feels good too. So I'll be taking that out, and let me show you. I'll go ahead and take the whole thing out now. This is my homemade tailstock die holder, or for the tap holder for tapping the internal threads. This is exactly what I used for tapping these threads in the 1/4 inch round steel that I just silver soldered into the frame here. So take that out. I lucked out. I got these Model Engineer taps from Kronos. Bought a whole set several years ago. If you get on their mailing list, the Kronos company over there in the UK, they had a set, and it was just a holiday sale or something. It was like half price. So even with shipping from England, it wasn't terrible. And definitely to have a set like this, it was well worth the price and the effort and the weight. So that's this part. Like I said, I'm going to oil it down, sand it up with some 600 grit, and get rid of some of the little fire scale marks and so forth, make it bright and shiny again. But really, really happy with how this came out. I couldn't be more thrilled, actually. And here, let me set this down and show you the screws. These things I've just, last time you saw these, they were coated with that cherry red stuff, the scale from that, I believe it's calcium carbonate, I'm not really sure, but the case hardening compound. So what you do after the second time you heat them up, then you saw me quench them in the water in that little pickle jar. I let them sit in the pickle jar for quite some time until they cooled off, and then I took them out and I rinsed them off in soapy water. And then I held them with a vice grip. Probably didn't even really need to do that, but I did. And then I used the wire wheel on the Dremel to clear all that stuff off. And I did it on both of them. And after I got done with that, I couldn't resist the temptation taking a file and see if it would cut in the end there, because that's the part that we're trying to case harden, because as you know, it goes into this part here on the gimbal head. Well, the file just skipped right off. It would not cut. So the case hardening is effective. I don't know how deep it is, but it's plenty fine for the purpose of this little gimbal screw here. So if that shows up okay. Alright, so very pleased with how these things have come out so far. If I have to, let's try threading them in and see how that, oh yeah, perfect. And I was a little concerned like I might have to run over them with the tailstock die again to clean up those threads on the screws, but not to worry, that's just fine. So that's how the screws look in there. Looks fairly decent, fairly professional. And again, none of this has been really polished up, just cleaned with a wire wheel. So we'll get that done and make sure it all is AJ squared away. Thanks for watching, everybody. I will keep you posted.